Our next speaker, and thank you all, this is pretty intense stuff. I just want to say and acknowledge that, but it also is something that everybody needs to know. This is about what we eat. This is about what we drink. This is about what we breathe. And our next speaker is somebody who can talk very substantively, very knowledgeably about some of the issues of concern. Gail Hansen is the Senior Officer and Staff Veterinarian with the Pew Campaign on Human Health and Industrial Farming of the Pew Charitable Trust. She served as a state epidemiologist and state public health veterinarian for 12 years with the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, where her work centered on infectious diseases and developing public health policy. Before that, she was a principal investigator and coordinator of blood-borne pathogen studies at the Seattle and King County Departments of Public Health. She has served on or chaired numerous state and federal infectious disease committees and as a scientific advisor for national and international conferences, and is adjunct faculty at Kansas State University College of Veterinary Medicine. Dr. Hansen will be talking about the threats corporate farming poses immediately to farmers, workers, and surrounding communities. She'll give an overview of some of these risks with particular emphasis on antibiotic resistance in food animals and in the environment as a result of corporate policies. The crowded, stressful conditions of CAFOs increases the likelihood of disease developing and spreading. Industrial farms have responded to animal disease issues by adding antibiotics to food animal feeds rather than addressing the underlying problems. Dr. Hansen.
Hello, everybody, and it's been interesting. I'm looking forward to what else we're going to be hearing this evening. Let's see, I figured out how to move this thing. There we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about the health effects of CAFOs, both in the community and for the farmers themselves. And I'm a member of the American Public Health Association, APHA, and back in 2003, APHA recommended that there be a moratorium on CAFOs, mostly because we had really no idea of what the risks were to the public and public health. And APHA said, let's put a hold on CAFOs until we can get some more information and figure out what is going on, what's sort of resolve some of the uncertainties, especially what's going on with children and infants who are especially at risk. Asking the federal government, the state governments to really look at the exposures to air, soil, water, and public health. We certainly know that there's worker health and safety issues, and there's community health and safety issues. I'm not going to touch very much on soil, water, air, because other folks have done that, and I'm going to probably skip over a couple of things that Daniel Inhofe talked about very well. And I got to still figure out how to do this. So worker health and safety. Certainly injuries are a big problem if you're working on farms, either as a farmer or a farm worker. And in fact, for the Bureau of Labor Statistics for the last couple of years, they lumped farming, forestry, and fisheries all together, but it was only one of two sectors of all the different types of work in the U.S. where there was an increase rather than a decrease of injuries and illnesses. So that means that they're going in the wrong direction compared to every other sector of work in the United States. Asphyxia is certainly a problem for some of the farmers, of whether you're working in lagoons or on some of the silos of just the hydrogen sulfide, the ammonia, or lack of oxygen that you can run into in these CAFOs, and people actually die. You can go into a lagoon and never come out. Hydrogen sulfide, which gives you that sort of rotten egg smell. When I worked for the Department of Health and Environment in Kansas, as the environment folks said, well, hydrogen sulfide, which is that rotten egg smell, it's like, first you smell it, then you don't, then you're dead, is how they characterize it. So as the level gets higher and higher and higher, it gets to a point where it can and does kill you. Ammonia also has a very distinct odor. And then there's the illnesses that you get from working on or near farms. There's occupational asthma, and people who work on CAFOs have more asthma than the average population. So folks who are working on CAFOs, about 30% of them will end up with asthma, versus less than 10%, around 8% for the general population. Folks get asthma to the point where they can't work on the farms anymore. And then they have to work someplace else. Where else are they going to work? So and that's what they know, that's what they do, that's all they can do. And when they can't do that anymore, what do they do? I don't know. There's a thing called organic dust toxic syndrome. And that's that combination of dust that's been created from the CAFOs, which has animal dander and feed and toxins from the bacteria. As the bacteria die, they release toxins. That you breathe that in, you get bad lung disease, essentially. The other issues we run into is influenza. We're right in the middle of flu season, or actually we're sort of hopefully coming to the end of flu season. But flu is really a disease of birds, pigs, and people. And that virus does well in any one of us and can mix and mingle in any one of us. So if you have farmers who are going in there, farm workers who are not able to get vaccinated or not getting vaccinated, mixing their virus with the viruses of either pigs or birds or both, we're ending up with new variants of influenza that was sort of the pandemic flu that they had a couple of years ago was really a chimera of human, pig, and bird flu. And when researchers tend to look at these things, they tend to look at them individually. So they'll look at what does ammonia do? What does hydrogen sulfide do? What does organic dust do? But nobody's really looking at them as a combination. And people aren't going in and just smelling the ammonia and not smelling the hydrogen sulfide. It comes as a package. And then there's the issue, and that's what I'm going to talk more about here in just a second, is antibiotic resistance. That we're feeding low levels of antibiotics to farm animals to get them to grow faster and to compensate for the conditions that they're being grown in. We're creating antibiotic resistant bacteria, and we're creating it at very high levels. Folks, there was a study that was done in Virginia and Maryland a few years ago where poultry workers were 32 times more likely to have antibiotic-resistant bacteria than people who lived nearby. And then there's people who do live nearby. And I don't have very much here because there's not a lot of research that's been done. We do know that if you live near a CAFO, that you're more likely to have asthma than if you don't live near a CAFO. How much more? Not a lot of studies. Who's funding those studies? Not a lot of folk. And antibiotic resistance is certainly an issue in communities as much as it is on the farms themselves. And how big is this problem of antibiotic resistance? Well, I use a very conservative number of 73%. And what I look at is the amount of antibiotics that are used in humans that are also used in animals. So the industry says, oh, there's all these antibiotics that aren't used in humans at all. Okay, fine. Take those out of the equation. We're still looking at 73% of the antibiotics that are used in this country are given to food animals mostly to get them to grow faster, to compensate for unhygienic conditions. We don't know too much more than that. We don't know how it's given to the animals. We don't know which animals it's given to. We don't know if it's given to make them grow faster or to treat them for disease, because those details aren't given to us. They're being collected. Some of them are being collected, but it's not being reported out because it doesn't have to be. We do know that they are going in the feed, they go by injection, they go in the water. We know that most of the antibiotics are available over the counter. An antibiotic that you need to get treated for a disease, you have to go to your doctor and get a prescription. If it's going to an animal, it goes in the feed, it goes in the water, no prescription is needed. It's either comes in the feed and the farmer has no idea it's there, or the farmer can get it off the shelf. You can get it off the shelf. It costs about $30 for a bottle of tetracycline these days. As I said, it's given for growth promotion. It's given to animals to get them, to what the industry says, to keep them healthy. They say that they're creating healthier animals. I'd say that if you have to give antibiotics to animals to keep them healthy, that's not a healthy system. We also know that besides the normal antibiotic-resistant infections that we sort of hear about, that MRSA, and how many of you have heard of MRSA? Yeah, well, MRSA comes in sort of three flavors these days. We used to only think of it as a hospital disease. There's hospital-associated MRSA, and then it was in the community-associated MRSA. Now there's a livestock-associated MRSA. And what we do know from real, basically fancy-schmancy genetics that I can't explain very well, but basically they found that the livestock-associated MRSA started off as plain old staph that we all have on our, actually human staph that we have on our hands and in our nose. That's sort of normal flora. Got into the animal kingdom, into our livestock, not just the animal kingdom, but into our livestock. We created that to become a resistant organism by feeding low levels of antibiotics. Now it's coming back to infect people and going from person to person. We created that. We know we created that. The microbiologists have done the genetics to look at exactly how that's happened. That's a very scary thought. We're doing that. Urinary tract infections are getting harder and harder to treat. There's more and more evidence that that's being, that resistant urinary tract infections are being fueled by the antibiotics that are being fed, especially to poultry. Antibiotic resistance is not a real simple problem. I guess if it was simple, we'd have an answer by now. We do know that every time you use an antibiotic, you can select for resistance. So whether you're treating you for an infection you have or you're giving antibiotics to an animal, you can select for resistance. It just happens. But we've got 9 billion animals that we raise every year in this country for food. So every time you give an animal a low level of antibiotic, you've got another little vessel, another little petri dish that can create antibiotic organisms. And antibiotics are different from lots of other drugs. So if you're taking medication for diabetes or for a heart condition, how you take that medication only affects you. And whether you take it or not take it will only affect you. It affects you the same way all the time. It'll affect your kids and your grandkids the same way all the time. Antibiotics are different, because antibiotics don't affect you. They affect the bacteria that are in you or on you. So every time you take an antibiotic, every time an animal takes an antibiotic, it affects not only that animal and the disease or non-disease in that animal, but it affects your use of that antibiotic or someone else's use of that antibiotic in the future. So it's really a community, antibiotics is really a community issue. And as I said, antibiotics are given to healthy animals. They're given, they're available over the counter. There really is no monitoring. Nobody says, oh, you've given too much here, or you've been giving it over and over and over again for the same problem. Instead of dealing with the underlying problem, you're just sort of throwing antibiotics out on that. Nobody checks that. That's a perfect recipe for resistance, and that's what we're seeing. It's all very interconnected, so it's, I've got food animals in the middle, but, people are given antibiotics, food animals are given antibiotics, pets are given antibiotics. Most of the antibiotics, even if they're subtherapeutic, don't get metabolized by our system. They stay, especially if they're fed to us or fed to the animals, they stay in the gut. Well, they don't stay in the gut. Nothing stays in the gut. It all goes out eventually. And when it goes out as manure, it goes someplace. It doesn't disappear. It ends up in the water. It ends up in the soil. The soil, it becomes dust. It goes places. Insects, vermin move things around. We're moving the animals around to get them, we transfer them from place to place. We transfer them to get slaughtered. That's moving all that bacteria and all those antibiotic-resistant bacteria around. So it's a very interconnected kind of system. So it's not, we aren't going to be able to piece things out especially, but we can work on each piece of it. Keep trying to do the wrong thing. So what can we do? I work in D.C. and have been working on a policy level. So I'm going to talk, here in a minute or so about some federal things. And there's a piece of legislation called the Preservation of Antibiotics for Medical Treatment Act, or PAMTA, which has been, it's been introduced every year or every Congress since 2003, and it has never gotten to the point of getting a vote in Congress. But every year it gets introduced, and it was introduced again this year. So far, just on the House side, probably on the Senate side soon. And that says that antibiotics can be given to animals that are sick. Great idea. I'm a veterinarian. I think that's a good idea. If they have a bacterial infection, we need to treat them. Or the antibiotics can be given to animals if they've been exposed to the disease, and if you don't treat them, they will get sick, because you don't want to have a whole herd of pigs dying because you failed to treat them. But what you can't do is give them antibiotics to the animals to get them to grow faster, or to treat them for diseases that you've created because you're putting them together in crowded and unhealthy conditions. That's not allowed. It applies only the antibiotics that are used in human medicine. So like I said, there's some antibiotics used in veterinary medicine only. If they want to squander those, fine. But the drugs we use in human medicine, let's keep that. It's a pretty precious resource. And then FDA has come up with guidelines. They're voluntary guidelines, so they're asking the drug companies, they're asking the large producers, please don't use these anymore. We'd like that if we'd like to have you not use them for growth promotion. Whether you can use them for, having animals in crowded conditions is still a little bit up in the air. Voluntary, they keep saying they're going to finalize these guidances. They've been out for almost 2 years. They're not finalized yet. And FDA has no way to evaluate how well it's doing. FDA has said, well, if these guidances, this voluntary asking the drug companies to do this doesn't work, we might go to regulation, but we have to make sure it isn't working. But they have no plan to measure it. So how do they know if it's working? They guess, I guess. We would like to have a little bit of evaluation. We've tried working with Congress, working with FDA, talking to people to have them talk to their members of Congress and say, hey, wait a minute, let's at least get some data so we can be talking about what's really going on. So sort of in concluding all this and letting everybody else have a chance to speak, we all need to be good stewards of the environment. We need to be good stewards of antibiotics and antibiotic use, because it really is, we really are all in this together. And antibiotics is a pretty precious resource. We don't have a lot of new antibiotics coming down the pipeline. So when we run out of antibiotics, we're done. It used to be that people would die of a skin knee or a strep throat because we didn't have antibiotics to treat them. Now we have antibiotics, but if we get rid of those antibiotics, aren't working anymore. That strep throat, that skin knee, think about getting that hip replacement. Think about doing that cancer therapy, because the antibiotics aren't going to be there for you anymore. We're done. Thanks.